The air in the underground cellar was cool and still, a stark contrast to the relentless California sun he had been fleeing for days. For 11-year-old Samuel Morgan, the darkness was a sanctuary. His throat was a desert, his clothes were stiff with dirt, and his small body ached with a weariness that went far beyond muscle. It was here, beneath the dead and twisted vines of an abandoned Sonoma County estate, that his trembling fingers found the splintered edge of a wooden crate tucked away in a corner. Prying it open, he didn't find wine or forgotten tools, but something far more precious, a collection of leather-bound notebooks. He lifted the top one, its cover worn smooth by time. Opening it carefully, the scent of old paper and dried ink rose to meet him. The first line, written in a steady, elegant hand, was dated 1960. In that moment, surrounded by silence and the ghosts of a forgotten winery, Samuel felt a profound shift inside him. The gnawing fear that had been his only companion began to recede, replaced by a deep, inexplicable curiosity for a story that was not his own. This story is about how the past can sometimes reach forward to save a forgotten child's future. And if you believe that some connections are meant to be found, I encourage you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today, because the journey we're about to embark on is a testament to the quiet acts of kindness that echo through generations, and it's a story that deserves to be heard all the way to the end. Your engagement helps us bring more narratives like this to light, connecting a community of listeners who appreciate the power of a story to change a life. We are grateful to have you with us for this one, as it's a journey that will stay with you long after it's over. But to understand how a runaway boy, alone and with nowhere to go, ended up finding refuge in the words of a dead man, we have to rewind the clock. This moment of quiet discovery in the cool, dark cellar was not the beginning, but rather the culmination of a desperate escape. The real story begins 72 hours earlier, on a seemingly ordinary Saturday morning. It was a morning that started just like any other in the small, cramped house that was never a home, a morning where the stale air was thick with unspoken misery. It was on this morning that Samuel, while quietly performing his chores, overheard his own uncle Rick putting a price on his future, a price of $100 a month. Samuel Morgan was 11 years old, but he carried the quiet weight of someone much older. It had been 2 years since the ocean had claimed his parents, their small fishing boat lost to a sudden storm off the coast, leaving him an orphan in a world that had suddenly turned cold and unfamiliar. The transition from a life filled with the scent of salt air and the warmth of family to the cramped, stale existence in his uncle's house on the outskirts of Santa Rosa was brutal and swift. At 9, he was handed over to Rick, his mother's brother, and his only living relative. Any grief he was allowed was quickly buried under a relentless schedule of servitude, a new reality where he was no longer a child but a resource, a silent, moving part in a household that never once felt like a home. His world had shrunk to the size of his obligations, a map of chores and duties with no room for boyhood. He slept on a worn-out couch in the living room, a piece of furniture that smelled of dust and years of neglect. It offered no real comfort, only a temporary place to rest his aching body. Each morning his day began long before the sun, in the pre-dawn chill that seeped through the thin walls of the house. He learned to move like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum of the kitchen floor, careful not to wake Rick or his girlfriend, Brenda. There was no personal space for him here, no corner to call his own, not even a drawer for his few belongings. He was a guest who had overstayed a welcome that was never extended, an inconvenient reminder of a sister Rick rarely mentioned. The house itself felt oppressive, its low ceilings and cluttered rooms a physical representation of his trapped existence. His first task, every single day without exception, was to clean. He would wipe down the counters from the previous night's mess, wash the dirty dishes left in the sink, and sweep the floors, all with a practiced efficiency that belied his age. After the kitchen was presentable, he would prepare breakfast, toast, eggs, and coffee, the smell filling the small space. He worked with the concentration of someone who knew the consequences of a mistake, of a piece of burnt toast or a spilled cup of coffee. Rick's temper was a silent, looming presence in the house, a storm that could break with little warning. Samuel had learned early on that the best way to survive was to become invisible, to perform his duties so perfectly that he would scarcely be noticed at all, erasing himself from the landscape of his own life. By the time Rick and Brenda emerged, breakfast would be on the table. Samuel would retreat to a corner, eating his own small portion quickly and quietly. They rarely spoke to him, their conversations flowing around him as if he were another piece of furniture. Their indifference was a constant dull ache in his chest, a daily confirmation of his worthlessness in their eyes. He wasn't their nephew, he was the help. He was the reason they had an extra mouth to feed, an obligation they wore like a heavy coat. The food he was given was just enough to quell the hunger in his stomach, a calculated measure of fuel to ensure he could perform his duties for the rest of the day, nothing more. It was sustenance, not nourishment, devoid of any warmth or care. The school day was a strange, hollow reprieve. He would ride the bus and walk the hallways, surrounded by the noise and energy of other children, yet he felt a universe away from them. Their laughter, their complaints about homework, their plans for the weekend, it all sounded like a foreign language. He was too tired, too preoccupied with the life that waited for him after the final bell, to form friendships or participate in their games. He was an observer, watching from the periphery as other kids lived the childhood that had been stolen from him. Teachers sometimes looked at him with a flicker of concern, noting his quiet demeanor and the perpetual exhaustion in his eyes, but he never spoke up, never gave them a reason to look closer. He had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. As soon as school was over, his true workday began. There was no time for homework, no afternoon spent playing outside. He walked directly from the bus stop to his uncle's business, a small struggling car wash on the edge of town. The smell of cheap soap, hot asphalt, and car wax was the scent of his afternoons, a smell that clung to his clothes and hair long after he left. The sun would beat down on the cracked pavement, and Samuel would spend hours on his feet, his small frame moving with a grim determination. He would scrub tires, spray down cars with a high-pressure hose, and meticulously dry every surface until it gleamed, his movements becoming robotic and automatic after months of repetition. The work was physically demanding, leaving his muscles sore, and his hands raw and chapped from the constant exposure to water and cleaning chemicals. He would push a heavy vacuum cleaner through car interiors, pulling out dirt and forgotten trash, his back aching from bending over for hours on end. He did it all without complaint, knowing that any sign of fatigue would be met with scorn from his uncle. Rick wasn't a guardian. He was a foreman, overseeing his one-man unpaid workforce with a critical eye. He would bark orders, point out missed spots, and remind Samuel that he was earning his keep. The concept of payment, of a single dollar for his hours of hard labor, was never even considered. Inside, Samuel had built walls around his heart. He had locked away the memories of his parents, of a life where he was loved and cherished, because thinking of them was too painful. It was a wound that would never heal, and his current reality offered no solace, no time to grieve. A quiet resignation had settled deep within him, a belief that this was all life would ever be. He existed in a state of low-grade, constant fear, fear of his uncle's anger, fear of doing something wrong, but most of all the deep, unspoken fear that he would be trapped in this cycle forever, that he would simply fade away until there was nothing left of the boy he used to be. Yet, even in the suffocating darkness of his life, a tiny flicker of his former self remained. It was in the way he would sometimes stare at the distant hills, imagining what lay beyond them. It was in the small, secret act of saving a portion of his meager breakfast, tucking away a granola bar or a piece of fruit when no one was looking. He didn't know why he did it. There was no plan, no destination in mind. It was a primal instinct for survival, a subconscious preparation for a future he couldn't yet imagine. These small acts were his only form of rebellion, a quiet insistence that he was more than just a servant, that somewhere inside this exhausted 11-year-old, a boy named Samuel Morgan still existed. He held on to one tangible piece of his past, a small, faded photograph of his parents, tucked away in the pocket of his only jacket. They were smiling, standing on their boat with the sun setting over the ocean behind them. In the photo, his father's arm was around his mother's shoulder, and they both looked happy and full of life. He would only dare to look at it in the dead of night, when the house was silent, tracing their faces with his finger. The photograph was a sacred, painful relic, a reminder that he was born of love, even if his life was now devoid of it. It was a promise of a different world, a world he was a part of, even if it felt like a dream. This routine of silent suffering and quiet endurance had become his normal. The days bled into one another, each one a mirror of the last, marked only by the changing seasons. He had stopped hoping for rescue, stopped dreaming of a different life. He had learned to expect nothing, to simply put one foot in front of the other and survive until the next sunrise. He was a child navigating an adult world of cruelty and neglect, armed with nothing but a faded photograph and a deep, buried instinct to endure. He had no idea that his entire world, as bleak as it was about to be shattered by a few overheard words. That Saturday morning began just like any other. Samuel woke in the dark, folded the thin blanket on the couch, and started his chores in the kitchen. The familiar rhythm of his tasks was almost meditative, a way to numb his mind to the emptiness of his existence. He prepared the breakfast, set the table, and waited for Rick and Brenda to appear. The air was still, thick with the unspoken misery that always lingered in the small house. He was just a boy, going through the motions of a life he never chose, completely unaware that this day, this ordinary, unremarkable Saturday, would be the day that everything changed. The foundation of his fragile survival was about to crack, forcing him to run toward a future he couldn't possibly foresee. The threat that had been a shapeless, looming shadow over Samuel's life took on a clear and brutal form on that Saturday morning. He wasn't in the house, but at the car wash, the place where his afternoons were spent in exhausting servitude. The sun was already high in the sky, beating down on the cracked asphalt and making the air thick with the smell of wet pavement and chemical soap. He was in the back, organizing a shelf of grimy rags and cleaning supplies, the repetitive motion of familiar, mind-numbing comfort. The small office door was propped open with a dirty cinder block to let in a breeze, and from within he could hear his uncle's voice, a low rumble that was usually reserved for complaining customers or barking orders at him. But this time, the tone was different. It was the sound of business, cold and transactional. He didn't mean to listen, not at first. The sounds of the car wash, the high-pitched whine of the industrial vacuums and the percussive hiss of the pressure washers usually drowned out everything else. But then he heard his own name, or rather, a description of him. Rick was on the phone, and his voice carried a chilling clarity across the short distance. He heard him describe the boy as a hard worker, someone who never complained and did exactly as he was told. Samuel froze, his hand hovering over a pile of damp towels. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He knew with a certainty that settled like ice in his stomach that this conversation was about him, and it was not a conversation a guardian would have about his nephew. It was the sound of a man discussing a commodity. The words that followed were like individual stones being dropped into a deep, dark well. Samuel heard the name of a foreman he didn't know, a man who worked for one of the large wineries deep in the valley. Rick was negotiating terms, his voice smooth and persuasive. He spoke of the upcoming harvest season, a time of intense, backbreaking labor that drew in temporary workers from all over. Samuel heard the term bunkhouse, and a stark image flashed in his mind. A cramped, dirty room filled with strangers, a place even less his own than the lumpy couch in Rick's living room. He heard the phrase, sunrise to sunset, and he could almost feel the phantom ache in his bones, an exhaustion that would eclipse anything he had ever known before. The final details of the arrangement solidified the horror, turning abstract fear into a concrete reality. Rick confirmed the price, $100 a month. It was a pitiful sum for the labor being described, but the most soul-crushing part was the instruction that followed. The money wasn't for Samuel, it was to be paid directly to Rick, a monthly fee for handing his nephew over to a life of indentured servitude. In that moment, the entire world seemed to shrink down to the sound of his uncle's voice, cheerfully sealing the deal. He was no longer a person, not even a burden. He was an asset, a small but steady source of income to be rented out to the highest bidder. The noise of the car wash faded into a distant, muffled roar in his ears. After Rick hung up the phone, A second voice emerged from the office, confirming the betrayal with a casual cruelty that was almost worse than Rick's cold negotiation. It was Brenda. Her tone was light, laced with a palpable sense of relief. She said something about how they would finally have the house to themselves again, and how the extra cash would make things easier. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air and pierced Samuel's heart. There was no concern for him, no flicker of conscience. To them, his absence was a double victory, more privacy and more money. He was an inconvenience they had successfully managed to liquidate, and they were celebrating their good fortune. A profound and terrifying clarity washed over Samuel. It felt as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the raw, unvarnished truth of his existence. He was not family. He was a transaction, a problem that had finally been solved. The past 2 years of his life replayed in his mind, but with this new understanding, every act of neglect, every dismissive word, every meager meal was cast in a new light. It wasn't just indifference. It was a calculated use of a resource. He was a tool to be used until a more profitable opportunity presented itself. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if the very foundation of his world had crumbled to dust, leaving him suspended in a cold, empty void. The shock did not last long. It quickly hardened into something else, something sharp and resolute. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was now overshadowed by an absolute certainty. He could not stay. He could not wait for the foreman to come and collect him. He could not spend one more night on that couch, under the roof of a man who had just sold his future for $100 a month. The house had never been a home, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a holding cell. He was simply waiting for his transfer, and the date had just been set. The instinct for survival, the one he had nurtured in secret by stashing away pieces of food, suddenly roared to life. He looked around at the car wash, at the soapy water running in dirty rivers across the pavement, at the sun glinting off the hoods of the cars. This place, this life, was a prison, and he had just overheard the warden discussing the terms of his life sentence. There was no one to appeal to, no one to tell. The teachers at school saw a quiet boy, not a desperate one. The world saw an orphan being cared for by his only relative. No one could see the truth that was now screaming in his mind. He was completely and utterly on his own, and his only chance at freedom was to take it for himself, right now before the gate slammed shut for good. The decision was not a conscious thought, but a physical imperative. It settled into his bones, a silent, unshakable command from the deepest part of himself. He had to run. He didn't know where he would go or how he would survive, but he knew with every fiber of his being that any unknown danger in the world beyond was better than the certain damnation that awaited him here. He slowly, deliberately, placed the rag he was holding back on the shelf. His movements were calm, almost robotic, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. The normal sounds of the Saturday morning returned, but they sounded different now, like the noises of a world he no longer belonged to. His life as Rick's nephew, as an unpaid servant, was over. It had ended the moment his future was given a price. The world did not crash down around Samuel in a wave of noise and fury. Instead, it went silent. The high-pitched whine of the vacuum, the hiss of water, the distant sound of traffic, it all receded into a dull, hollow hum. In its place was a single ringing truth that was louder than any sound he had ever heard. He was being sold. The realization was not a thought, but a physical sensation, a cold dread that started in the pit of his stomach and spread through his limbs, turning his blood to ice. The shock lasted only a moment before it was consumed by a powerful, primal instinct. The quiet resignation he had lived with for 2 years shattered, replaced by an unshakable resolve. He could not wait for the foreman. He could not endure another sunset under this roof. The decision was made not in his mind, but in his very soul. He was leaving. His movements became deliberate, stripped of all hesitation. The boy who had learned to be invisible now used that skill for his own survival. He placed the damp rag he was holding back on the shelf, his hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. His mind, now startlingly clear, began to form the barest outline of a plan. It wasn't a strategy for a new life, but a simple, desperate sequence for escape. First, he needed his resources. He thought immediately of the small, tattered backpack he kept hidden behind the couch, the one containing the granola bars he'd been secretly saving and a half-empty bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had. He needed to get back to the house, retrieve the bag, and disappear before Rick and Brenda returned from the car wash. The clock was ticking, and every second he remained was a second closer to being trapped forever. He slipped away from the back of the car wash, keeping the small office in his peripheral vision. Through the dusty window, he could see his uncle leaning back in his chair, laughing at something Brenda had said. The casual cruelty of their happiness was a spur, driving him forward. They wouldn't miss him, not right away. They would assume he was still working, lost in the noise and the endless tasks. Their predictable routine, the very thing that had imprisoned him, now offered him a narrow window of opportunity. He knew they usually stayed in the office for at least an hour on Saturdays, counting the morning's meager earnings. This was his chance. He moved quickly, his worn sneakers silent on the gravel path that led away from the car wash and toward the street where the house waited. The short walk back to the house felt like a journey across a vast, dangerous desert. Every passing car, every barking dog sent a jolt of panic through him. He kept his head down, his face a mask of neutrality, betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. This was the point of no return. Once he took that backpack, there was no going back to the couch, no pretending he hadn't heard. He mentally rehearsed his next steps: slide the key into the lock, turn it slowly, slip inside, grab the bag, and leave through the back door. The fear was a living thing, a cold hand gripping his throat, but the image of the foreman's bunkhouse, of a life spent in forced labor, was a far more terrifying monster. He pushed the fear down, fueled by the memory of his uncle's voice putting a price on his life. Inside, the house was suffocatingly still. The familiar smells of stale air and Brenda's cheap perfume now seemed menacing. This place had never been a home, but now it felt like a cage he was about to break out of. He moved on instinct, his feet carrying him silently across the linoleum floor to the living room. There, behind the lumpy, stained couch, was his backpack. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the worn fabric. For a brief second, he paused, taking one last look at the room. This was the space where he had spent the last 2 years of his life, a ghost in someone else's story. He felt no sadness, no nostalgia, only a profound and final sense of detachment. He was leaving nothing behind because he had never been allowed to have anything here in the first place. With the backpack clutched in his hand, he quickly checked its contents. The 2 granola bars were there along with the water bottle. It was a pathetic amount of supplies for a journey to nowhere, but it felt like a treasure. Then his fingers brushed against the worn denim of his jacket, which was also stuffed in the bag. He reached into the pocket and felt the cool, smooth surface of the photograph. He didn't dare take it out, but just touching it was enough. The image of his parents, smiling and alive, was a silent source of strength, a reminder that he came from love, not servitude. This small, faded square of paper was his most important provision, the one thing that would sustain him when the food and water ran out. It was his reason to run, his proof that a better world had once existed. He crept toward the back of the house, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The plan was working. He was seconds away from freedom. Just as his hand reached for the doorknob of the back door, he heard it, the unmistakable rumble of his uncle's truck turning onto their street. Panic seized him. They were back early. He was trapped. For a terrifying moment, he froze, his mind blank with fear. The sound of the truck's engine cutting off was the trigger that broke his paralysis. There was no time to think, no time for doubt. He yanked the back door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, and slipped out into the overgrown yard. He didn't dare close the door, terrified the sound would give him away. He scrambled toward the rickety wooden fence at the back of the property, his backpack bouncing against his spine. He could hear the front door of the house opening, could hear Rick's voice calling his name, a casual command for some forgotten chore. The sound was like a physical push, propelling him forward with a fresh surge of adrenaline. He threw himself over the fence, the splintered wood digging into his palms, and dropped ungracefully into the alley behind the house. Without a single look back, without a destination in mind, Samuel Morgan just started walking, his small figure quickly disappearing down the dusty alley, heading toward the distant hills that promised the only thing he cared about: escape. The alley was a corridor of grit and discarded things, the air thick with the smell of sun-baked garbage and dry weeds. Samuel didn't run. He walked with a frantic, shuffling urgency, his small body propelled by a terror that was colder and sharper than any pain he had ever known. Each crunch of gravel under his worn sneakers sounded like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet. He resisted the overwhelming urge to look back, convinced that if he did, he would see his uncle's silhouette framed at the end of the alley. A monster emerging from the past he was so desperately trying to outrun. His world had shrunk to this narrow passage, a straight line away from everything he knew. The only direction that mattered was forward. The splintered wood of the fence had left a raw, stinging scrape on his palm, but he barely felt it. The only sensation was the frantic thumping of his own heart, a drumbeat for his escape. He reached the end of the alley and peered cautiously around the edge of a dilapidated garage. The street was quiet, bathed in the harsh light of the late morning sun. For a moment, he was paralyzed by indecision. Left would take him back toward the center of town, toward people and police and questions he couldn't answer. Right led toward the edge of the suburbs, toward the dusty, undeveloped hills that had always been a hazy backdrop to his life. The hills represented an unknown, a vast and intimidating wilderness, but they also promised anonymity. They promised a place where a small, forgotten boy could simply vanish. He took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs, and turned right, his path chosen not by logic, but by a primal need to disappear into the landscape itself. The suburban streets were a gauntlet of perceived threats. Every curtained window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. The sound of a lawnmower starting up nearby sent a jolt of pure panic through him, and he ducked behind a parked car, his breath held tight in his chest until the noise became a steady, non-threatening drone. He walked with his head down, his gaze fixed on the cracks in the sidewalk, trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. A woman watering her flowers looked up as he passed, her expression one of mild curiosity. Samuel's heart leaped into his throat. He quickly averted his eyes and pulled the hood of his thin jacket over his head, a flimsy disguise that did little to hide him, but made him feel slightly less exposed to a world that suddenly felt entirely hostile. After what felt like an eternity of navigating the neat, orderly streets, he spotted a dirt path cutting between two houses, overgrown with weeds and clearly unused. It was a lifeline. He darted onto it without a second thought, the soft earth a welcome relief after the hard pavement. The path ran alongside a dry creek bed, hidden from the street by a line of dusty oak trees. Here he could finally move without the constant fear of being seen. The sounds of the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by the chirping of unseen insects and the rustle of lizards in the dry leaves. He was leaving the world of houses and fences behind, stepping into something wilder. The sun beat down and he could feel the heat radiating up from the ground, a constant, oppressive force. The initial surge of adrenaline began to wane, and a deep, aching exhaustion started to set in. His legs, unused to this kind of sustained effort, felt heavy and weak. His throat was a desert, a raw, scratchy hollow that begged for water. He found a spot behind a large, sun-bleached boulder and slid to the ground, his back against the warm stone. His hands trembled as he unscrewed the cap of his water bottle. He allowed himself only 3 small sips, rationing the precious liquid with a discipline born of terror. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the most wonderful thing he had ever felt. He closed his eyes for just a moment, listening to the sound of his own ragged breathing, a stark reminder that he was alive, and, for now, free. He pushed himself back to his feet, knowing he couldn't rest for long. Rick would have noticed he was gone by now. The thought sent a fresh spike of fear through him, giving his tired muscles a renewed, albeit fragile, strength. He continued to follow the winding dirt path as it began to climb gently, leading him further into the rolling hills. The landscape was changing, the manicured lawns of the suburbs giving way to fields of dry golden grass and patches of tough gnarled chaparral. The air smelled of dust and wild sage. He was entering a world that operated on different rules, a place where survival was not about being invisible in a house, but about enduring the elements. The vast, empty space was both liberating and terrifying in its indifference. His progress was slow, a steady, determined plodding. The sun was a merciless weight on his shoulders, and sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. He focused on the simple mechanics of walking, one foot in front of the other, a monotonous rhythm that kept the panic at bay. His mind was a chaotic swirl of the last few hours, the sound of his uncle's voice on the phone, the casual cruelty in Brenda's laughter, the splintering wood of the fence. These memories were the fuel for his journey, the ghosts at his back that prevented him from even considering turning around. Every step he took was an act of defiance, a silent scream that he was not a piece of property to be bought and sold. The path eventually ended at a rusted, sagging, barbed wire fence that stretched as far as he could see in either direction. It was another barrier, another wall between him and safety. A wave of despair washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. For a fleeting second he thought about giving up, about just sitting down and waiting for whatever came next. But then, the image of a foreman's truck arriving to collect him, of a cramped bunkhouse filled with strangers, flashed in his mind with brutal clarity. The image was a jolt, a shock that reignited his will. He began to walk along the fence line, his eyes scanning for a weakness, and after 100 yards, he found it, a spot where the lowest strand of wire was loose. He dropped to his stomach and wriggled underneath, the barbs catching on his shirt and tearing the fabric, but he didn't care. He was through. Now he was in a vast, open pasture, the dry grass crunching under his feet. The hills were no longer a distant promise, but a real physical presence looming before him. He felt impossibly small, a tiny, moving speck under an enormous, indifferent blue sky. The sheer scale of the wilderness was overwhelming. There were no paths here, no signs to follow. His vulnerability was absolute. If he fell, if he got hurt, there would be no one to help him. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the grass. This was a different kind of prison, one without walls, but the freedom was laced with a new and potent kind of fear. He was the master of his own fate, and he was only 11 years old. The thirst was now a constant, raging fire in his throat. His tongue felt thick and swollen in his mouth, and every swallow was painful. He took another tiny sip of water, the remaining amount in the bottle sloshing with a terrifyingly hollow sound. He knew it wouldn't last much longer. Hunger was a dull ache in his stomach, but he ignored it, saving the 2 granola bars as a last resort. His priorities had been stripped down to the most basic elements of survival: water, shelter, and distance. He needed to find a place to hide before nightfall, a place where he could be safe from both the elements and the man who might be looking for him. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. His pace had slowed to a weary shuffle. The initial fear-driven energy had been completely consumed, leaving only a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Each step was an effort of will. His backpack, which had felt so light at the beginning, now seemed to weigh 100 pounds, its straps digging into his sore shoulders. He was no longer thinking about the past or the future. His entire existence was focused on the next few feet of ground in front of him. He was a creature of pure instinct now, a small animal fleeing a predator, driven by the single, unthinking imperative to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the cage he had just escaped. The world had become a simple, brutal equation of motion versus capture. Through a dip in the hills he saw it, a thin ribbon of dirt road, barely more than 2 tire tracks, winding its way deeper into the terrain. It was a sign of human passage, which was both a risk and a potential guide. A car could use that road, but it was also a path that led somewhere. Standing there with the last of his strength draining away, he had to make another choice. To stay in the open fields meant safety from being easily seen, but the road offered a clearer path forward. He chose the road. He stumbled toward it, his legs trembling with exhaustion, hoping it would lead him to some kind of shelter, some forgotten place where he could rest, where he could finally stop running. The dirt road was a cruel deception, a line of hope that seemed to stretch into an infinite sun-scorched horizon. Each step sent a jarring shock through Samuel's exhausted body, and the world had begun to blur at the edges, a wavering haze of heat and fatigue. Just as he felt the last of his strength about to abandon him, he saw it. Through the shimmering air, set back from the road, was a property that seemed to have surrendered to time itself. Rows of gnarled skeletal grapevines clawed at the dry earth, their lifeless branches twisted into shapes of agony. Beyond them stood the weathered, decaying skeletons of wooden buildings, their roofs sagging and their walls bleached grey by decades of unforgiving sun. It was a place of ghosts and failure, but to a boy with nowhere else to go, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was shelter. He veered off the road, his feet sinking into the soft, dusty soil. The silence here was different, heavier. It was the silence of abandonment. He moved cautiously toward the largest of the decaying structures, a long, low building that might have once been a processing facility. The wood groaned under his tentative touch, threatening to splinter. He circled it, his eyes scanning for any opening, any way inside that would shield him from the relentless sun. He found nothing but boarded-up windows and a door that was swollen shut in its frame. A wave of despair, cold despite the heat, washed over him. But then, near the foundation of the building, half hidden by a patch of stubborn, thorny weeds, he saw it. A flat, rusted metal plate set into the ground, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. With a surge of desperate energy, he cleared the weeds away, his raw hands stinging as they were scratched by the thorns. He gripped the cold iron ring with both hands and pulled. It resisted at first, sealed by years of rust and dirt, but then with a deep groaning scrape it moved. He slid it aside, revealing a dark square opening and a set of steep stone stairs descending into blackness. A gust of cool, earthy air rose from the opening, a stark and welcome contrast to the furnace outside. It smelled of damp stone, of dust, and of something else, something old and still. Without a moment of hesitation, he swung his legs over the edge and began his descent, leaving the harsh, bright world behind him for the promise of the cool, silent dark. The air in the underground cellar was a physical relief, so cool and still, it felt like stepping into a different season, a different reality. The oppressive California sun he had been fleeing for days was instantly vanquished, its heat and light unable to penetrate this subterranean sanctuary. His throat, which had felt like a desert of sandpaper, seemed to unclench slightly in the moist air. The silence was absolute, a profound and complete absence of sound that was almost startling after the constant whisper of the wind and the crunch of his own footsteps. He stood at the bottom of the stone steps, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, and for the first time in 72 hours, the frantic, hunted feeling in his chest began to subside. He was hidden. He was safe. As his vision cleared, he saw that he was in a long, tunnel-like space carved directly from the earth and rock. The walls were rough-hewn stone, and lining them were rows upon rows of massive oak barrels. Their metal hoops rusted, and their wood darkened with age. They sat like silent, sleeping sentinels in the gloom, ghosts of a purpose long since past. A thick layer of dust coated everything, a soft grey blanket that had settled over decades, preserving the space in a state of suspended animation. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, dry earth, and the faint, phantom memory of wine. He was standing in the heart of a forgotten dream, and in its stillness he found a moment of peace. He let his backpack slide from his aching shoulders, the soft thud of it hitting the dirt floor, the only sound in the vast quiet. He sank down, his back against the cool stone wall, and the sheer bone-deep weariness he had been holding at bay finally washed over him in a crushing wave. His legs trembled uncontrollably, and his head felt heavy. He was just an 11-year-old boy, and he had walked for what felt like a lifetime. Here, in the darkness, there was no one to see his weakness, no need to pretend he was strong. The gnawing fear that had been his only companion, the fear of his uncle, of being caught, of the unknown, began to recede, replaced by the simple, profound relief of having finally stopped running. He didn't know how long he sat there, simply breathing in the cool, still air, but eventually a flicker of his innate curiosity returned. His eyes, now fully accustomed to the gloom, scanned the far corners of the cellar, which were illuminated by thin shafts of light from unseen ventilation slits high up on the walls. In one corner, mostly hidden in shadow, was a large, thick tarp draped over a stack of something. It was the only object in the cellar that seemed deliberately protected. Pushing himself to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest, he walked slowly toward it, each step echoing softly in the cavernous space. He reached out and pulled back a corner of the heavy, dusty canvas. Underneath were not more barrels, but several neatly stacked wooden crates. They were simple, unadorned boxes, the kind used for shipping or storage, but they felt different from the rest of the abandoned cellar. They felt intentional. He ran his hand over the splintered edge of the top crate, a sense of anticipation building inside him. What could be so important that it was left here, covered and protected, in a place forgotten by time? Using his fingers, he found a loose board and began to pry at it. The wood was old and brittle, and with a sharp crack, a piece of the lid broke away, creating an opening large enough to see inside. He peered into the darkness of the crate, expecting to see old tools or perhaps even forgotten bottles of wine. But what he saw made him stop, his breath catching in his throat. The crate was filled not with objects but with books, or rather notebooks. They were bound in dark, worn leather, dozens of them, packed tightly together. He reached in with a trembling hand and lifted the top one. It felt heavy and substantial, its cover worn smooth by time and handling. A faint, pleasant scent rose from it, the smell of old paper, dried ink. Hand leather. He carried it over to one of the thin beams of light, his heart pounding with a strange and unfamiliar emotion. It was in that moment, surrounded by the silent ghosts of a forgotten winery, that the circle of his journey began to close. This was the moment that had been waiting for him at the end of his desperate flight. He sat on the dirt floor, the notebook resting in his lap, and carefully opened the cover. The pages were filled with a steady, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. At the top of the first page, a date was written, 1960. As Samuel read that first line, a profound and irreversible shift occurred within him. The gnawing fear, the crushing loneliness, the overwhelming exhaustion, it all began to dissolve, replaced by a deep, inexplicable, and all-consuming curiosity for a story that was not his own, but which he felt with an unshakable certainty he was meant to find. For 3 days, the cellar was Samuel's entire universe. The thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom were his clock, marking the passage of time as he rationed his 2 granola bars and drank sparingly from a rusty tap he found in the corner, the water tasting of iron and earth. But his true sustenance came from the notebooks. He devoured Vittorio Benedetti's life, reading by the faint light, the elegant script becoming as familiar as his own thoughts. He learned of Vittorio's voyage from a small village in Italy, a young man with nothing but a dream of growing grapes in the fertile California soil. He felt the man's joy in the descriptions of his first successful harvest, the deep love for his wife Elena, and the pride he felt watching his children grow up among the vines that he had planted with his own 2 hands. Samuel felt a strange kinship with this man he had never met. He recognized the ache of loss in Vittorio's words when he wrote about Elena's passing, a grief so profound it seemed to stain the very paper. He understood the crushing weight of failure in the entries from the early 1980s, as a relentless drought turned the vibrant vineyard into a brittle, brown wasteland. Vittorio's dream was dying, and Samuel felt each pang of that loss as if it were his own. This man from the past was not a ghost. He was a presence, a companion in the silent darkness. His story filled the empty spaces inside Samuel, making him feel less alone than he had in years. The journals were a testament to a life fully lived, with all its triumphs and sorrows, a stark contrast to his own small, hollow existence. He reached the final entries written in 1985. The winery was lost. The children had moved away to build their own lives, and Vittorio was an old man alone with his memories. In one of the last passages, he wrote of a final act of hope. He described hiding important documents deep within the cellar, tucked away in a place no one would think to look. He wrote that he was leaving them for his grandchildren, should they ever feel the pull to return to the land, to understand the roots from which they came. A new energy surged through Samuel. He was no longer just a reader, he was part of the story now, a keeper of this final, secret wish. He began to search, his hands tracing the cool stone walls, his heart pounding with a sense of purpose. Behind a stack of rotting wooden staves he found it, a small, loose stone in the wall. He pried it out with his fingers, the rock crumbling at the edges, revealing a dark cavity. Reaching inside, his hand closed around a thick, oilskin-wrapped package. He carried it back to his small patch of light and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a sealed manila envelope yellowed with age. On the front, in Vittorio's familiar, elegant hand, were the words, "To my grandchildren," or whoever may find this. The words seemed to speak directly to him, a message sent across time to the one person who needed it most. He felt a tremor in his hands, a sense that he was holding something sacred, a bridge between a forgotten past and his own uncertain future. But before he opened the letter, he picked up the last of the journals, the one from 1975, a year Vittorio had described as one of his best. He opened to a random page, his eyes scanning the script, and then he froze. The words seemed to leap off the page, rearranging the entire world as he knew it. Vittorio was writing about his dearest friend, a man he had met shortly after arriving in California. He described him as a man of the sea, with hands as tough as leather and a heart as vast as the ocean he worked. He wrote about their shared dreams as immigrants, one of the land and one of the sea. And then he wrote the name, Joseph Morgan. His friend, the fisherman, was Samuel's own paternal grandfather. A profound, ringing silence filled Samuel's mind. The cellar, the journals, the dead vines upstairs, none of it was random. He wasn't a trespasser who had stumbled upon a stranger's story by chance. He was connected to this place, tied to it by a bond of friendship that had existed long before he was born. He traced the name Joseph Morgan with his finger, the ink a tangible link to a family he barely remembered. He thought of the faded photograph in his pocket, of his father standing on the boat. His father was Joseph's son. This place, this forgotten winery, was part of his own history, a chapter he never knew had been written. He was not just a runaway. He was standing on ground that had been walked by his own grandfather. The realization was a key, unlocking a door inside him that had been sealed shut for 2 long years. A single tear escaped his eye, then another, until his shoulders began to shake with quiet, racking sobs. But these were not the tears of grief or fear he had choked back for so long. They were tears of relief, a deep, cleansing release of the crushing weight of his own insignificance. He was not a piece of driftwood tossed on a merciless sea. He had an anchor. He had roots. The world had not forgotten him, because a piece of him had been waiting here, in the words of an old man preserved in the cool, dark earth. He was the grandson of Joseph Morgan, and that meant something. He finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside were the deeds to the property and a short, simple letter. Vittorio wrote of his hope that his descendants would find value not in the land itself, but in the story it held, a story of hard work, love, and the courage to build something from nothing. He wrote that roots are not just about blood, but about the connections we make, the friendships we forge, and the dreams we plant in the ground for others to one day find. The letter ended with a simple Italian proverb, Chi pianta un albero, pianta una speranza. He who plants a tree, plants a hope. For Samuel, sitting in the darkness, Vittorio had planted an entire forest. The words of the letter and the revelation of the friendship settled over him like a warm blanket. His uncle's cruelty, the sale for $100, the lonely nights on the couch, it all seemed to shrink in the face of this immense, unexpected kindness. He had been so focused on what was taken from him that he never imagined something could be given back. Vittorio Benedetti, a man long dead, had given him back his own story. He had shown him that he belonged to a legacy of friendship and resilience, a legacy that was far more powerful than the neglect he had endured. He was not an asset to be sold. He was the inheritor of a hope planted decades ago. He clutched the journal to his chest, the worn leather a comforting weight against his heart. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady strength. He was no longer just hiding. He was waiting. He didn't know for what or for whom, but he knew with an unshakable certainty that his journey in the dark was over. This cellar was not an end, but a beginning. He had run from a house that was never a home, only to find the foundation of one in the most unlikely of places. He was Samuel Morgan, grandson of Joseph, and he was finally ready to step back into the light. On the morning of the fourth day, the square of light at the top of the stairs was suddenly blocked by a dark silhouette. Samuel's heart leaped with a familiar jolt of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of calm inevitability. A man's voice called down, hesitant and curious. It was Mark Bennett, Vittorio's grandson, a retired winemaker who had spent years searching for the property his mother had only vaguely described. He descended the stairs and stopped, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief at the sight of a small, dirt-streaked boy sitting on the floor, surrounded by his grandfather's journals. After hearing Samuel's story, a story punctuated by the boy pointing to his own grandfather's name in the worn leather book, Mark's shock turned to a quiet, determined anger. He took Samuel back to Santa Rosa and made a single phone call to Child Protective Services. The investigation was swift and decisive. The story of the $100 deal was horrifying enough, but when authorities discovered that Rick had been pocketing a $500 monthly life insurance payment left by Samuel's parents for the past 2 years, his fate was sealed. He lost custody immediately and faced a host of criminal charges for fraud and child endangerment. The world that had seemed so powerful and suffocating to Samuel crumbled in a matter of days. Justice, it turned out, was not just a word in a book. It was real, and it had finally found him. Using the journals as a guide, Mark began to piece together his family's history, and in doing so he pieced together Samuel's. He found a reference to Samuel's mother and her older sister, Helen, who had moved to Portland, Oregon years ago after a family argument and had lost touch. Mark located her, and the moment Helen heard about her nephew, a boy she thought was being cared for, she drove through the night to be there. For the first time since his parents' death, Samuel was enveloped in a hug that was not a memory, but a warm, living reality. Custody was granted without question, and he finally had a home. Mark, moved by the incredible story of connection that had unfolded in his family's cellar, decided to honor the past. He used his life savings to buy back the land and restore the winery. But he didn't name it after his grandfather alone. He named it the Vittorio and Joseph Winery, a testament to a friendship that had reached across generations to save a lost boy. He hired Helen, who had experience in business management, to run the winery, allowing her and Samuel to build a new life right there in Sonoma County. Today, at 15 years old, Samuel Morgan is no longer a ghost. He works alongside his aunt and Mark, his hands once raw from scrubbing cars, now learning the delicate art of tending to new living vines. He spends his afternoons not in a hot, asphalt lot, but walking through the cool, quiet cellar, the journals now preserved in a glass case for all to see. Mark established an educational fund for him, ensuring his future is as rich as his newly discovered past. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, he stands on the hill overlooking the valley, the same hills he once ran through in terror, and feels the steady, comforting weight of belonging. He knows that a life is not defined by what is lost, but by the unexpected hopes you find, planted long ago